In this video I'll be scribing and fitting a shelf to an alcove for a local independent barbershop here in Norwich called Courage Noble. This is the second out of 3 projects that I'm working on for them, following the recent bay window, bench seating window display unit things, which I have a video about already. Link to that in the description box below. First I needed to rip some battens which I'll later attach to the walls at the shop, and I did that in my workshop using the table saw. I'm using 18mm thick birch ply for this one, and I'm ripping it into 20mm strips. When I got to the barber shop I had a look at the alcove, and as is often the case with old buildings, none of the walls were straight or square. First I measured the wall at the back, and that measured 1390mm. And I needed to cut the shelf oversized initially, so I added 50mm to that measurement and made a mark at 1440mm onto my piece of birch ply. I then used my bevel gauge to take the angle for the left hand corner, and that was a bit less than 90 degrees. I could then use that to mark up the angle from the mark I'd just made, and I lengthened that line with a straight edge. I could then measure the angle at the right hand side of the corner of the alcove, and that wasn't 90 degrees either, it was a little bit more than 90 degrees, and I marked up that angle at the other end of the ply. I used my circular saw to make cuts along those lines. Next I wanted to figure out the angle that I wanted to cut the front edge of the shelf to, so I offered up a straight edge onto the floor and used my bevel gauge to take that angle. I also measured up the depth I wanted the shelf to be, and then I could mark that up on the ply too. Just realised I forgot to account for the thickness of the skirting board, so I'm just going to add that on. That's another 25mm. And I could do the same again for the right hand side. Next I joined those 2 lines using a straight edge. And I'd use a straight edge and a couple of F-clamps to guide the circular saw cut to get a perfectly straight edge. The problem I had though was that my straight edge was not quite long enough, so I just kind of wedged some masking tape and a piece of wood to get it to clamp down at the other end. And that actually worked well initially until I got further along with the cut, and that stuff was just getting in the way of the circular saw, so I ended up just taking it off and holding the straight edge down firmly with my spare hand. A track saw would be the perfect tool for this, but I don't have one of those. I could then check the cut was straight and it looked good. Next I could offer up the shelf to the alcove so that I could check how the shelf fits along the back wall. So it looks like I'm pretty good along the back edge of the wall. There is a small gap, but nothing that a little bit of caulk won't solve. Now I can scribe this side to fit the wall, and for that I'm going to use a compass. Just setting the compass to just wider than the gap at the back. And that's going to be my cut line. I made that cut using my jigsaw. I know that the back edge needs to be 1390mm, so I'm going to mark that up from the cut I just made. Now I can offer up that shelf again. And now I can set the compass to the mark I just made and scribe the next line. I could then make that cut with the jigsaw too. And then I offered up the shelf again. So it doesn't quite fit. I think I'm about 3 or 4mm out. So I'm just going to set the compass to the amount that I want to remove and scribe again. Next I wanted to add the battens. I measured and marked up to the height that the top needed to be at, and then used my spirit level to make a horizontal line. I could then offer up the batten, drill a pilot hole in the centre, and then add a screw. These walls were lined with MDF beneath the plasterboard, so there was no need to use wall plugs here. I could just screw directly into the wall. I could then use that centre screw as a pivot point for getting the spirit level bubble in the middle before adding the rest of the screws. I could also use the spirit level to offer up the battens for the walls at the sides. I'm going to be using polyurethane glue to stick the shelf down onto the battens. This stuff's really good and I'll link to it in the description box below. And before I add the glue, I first needed to add a bit of moisture to one of the surfaces, so I used a damp cloth. I could then add the glue and fit the shelf, and it was a really nice fit. To make sure that the plywood was properly seated onto the battens, I fired in a couple of brad nails, and then I filled the holes with some wood filler. After about 10 minutes you'll see that the polyurethane glue starts foaming up slightly, which works great to fill any gaps. So I wiped away the excess with a damp cloth. So this shelf was going to be really quite long at 1.39 meters, so next I cut a 50mm strip of the ply to use as a front trim for the shelf. This will add more rigidity to the plywood shelf and prevent it from flexing at the front. I marked up and cut it to length.
Yeah, we were sort of working in the window.
And then I made some marks where I wanted to add some dominoes so that I could get the trim perfectly aligned to the top face of the shelf. Alternatively, you could use biscuits or dowels for this. I glued in the dominoes, and the ones I had with me were actually too long, so I cut them down with a handsaw just so that they were protruding by about 12mm. I cut the corresponding domino joints into the trim piece.
One cupboard to get another set of keys, to then get another set of keys.
Then I could add glue and push it in place. It would have made more sense to add this trim piece before fitting the shelf so that you could add clamps to get a nice tight glue joint, but unfortunately I forgot to bring any clamps that were long enough to do that with me, so instead I fired a few brad nails in to hold it in place tightly. Then I could move on to sanding everything, and I just did that by hand using a 100 grit paper. I used the vacuum to clean off all of the dust, and then I applied masking tape to where the shelf met the walls so that I could add some white decorator's caulk. This stuff is paintable, so later on it can be painted the same colour as the walls and no gaps will be visible. I smoothed over the caulk with my finger and then I could remove the tape. Unfortunately the tape also took some of the paint off the wall, but that area of the wall was going to need to be repainted anyway, so it wasn't really a problem. I applied some water-based varnish as finish for the shelf. This will seal the wood and give it a nice satin sheen and make it more hard wearing. I'll leave a link to the stuff I use in the description box below. After about an hour it was dry enough that I could come back and denib with some 400 grit wet and dry paper just to smooth things over. I have a separate video all about denibbing which I'll link to below too. And then I could apply a final coat of finish. This was the first time I've ever scribed a shelf to fit an alcove. In the past, whenever I fitted shelves, I've always just made a template out of cardboard and used that to shape the wood, but this method is much quicker and much more accurate too. I learned all about it from another YouTuber, Gid Joyner. I'd highly recommend checking out his channel. He does some great on-site jobs which are interesting to see, and the videos are always full of excellent tips. I'll link to Gid's channel in the description box below. I'd recommend a great place to start with Gid's channel is his recent series of videos about a bay window seat installation. I'll link to that below too. It's fantastic. I'm really pleased with how the shelf turned out. If I could do it again, I would have definitely applied the trim before fitting the shelf. so that I could clamp it on there and get the joint nice and tight, but as I said, I didn't have any clamps with me that were long enough to do that. And anyway, the brad nails and domino combination did the job just fine. I'd also like to have used a better piece of ply. The piece I used had a few slight imperfections and infills in the grain, which you might have spotted in the video, but it was the only piece big enough that I had left over from the bench seats commission, and because birch ply is expensive, it didn't really make sense to buy another sheet. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you'd like to help support the channel, plus get early access to my videos, free cut lists and plans, exclusive content, and a name credit at the end of my videos, you can do so via Patreon, and there'll be a link to that in the description box below. Thank you for watching.